Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, on behalf of İstanbul ŞEHİR University, I would like to welcome you all to the third of ŞEHİR Talks. Today, we are honored to have a very distinguished speaker. He is Professor of Philosophy and Political Science and a Senior Fellow in the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. He holds a Doctor of Law degree from the University of Munich, Germany, and a PhD from Duke University, USA. He has been a visiting professor at Hamburg University in Germany, at the New School for Social Research in New York, and a fellow at Nuffield College in Oxford. He has been in India on a Fulbright research grant for a year. He is a past president of the Society for Asian and Comparative Philosophy and the honorary chair of the International Coordinating Committee of World Public Forum, Dialogue on Civilizations, Vienna and Moscow. Among his publications are The Twilight of Subjectivity, Beyond Dogma and Despair, Polis and Praxis, The Other Heidegger, Between Freiburg and Frankfurt, Margins of Political Discourse, and more recently, Beyond Orientalism, Dialogue Among Civilizations, In Search of the Good Life, Integral Pluralism Beyond Culture Wars, and the forthcoming Return to Nature, an ecological counter-history. In this evolving opus, he has been concentrating on exactly what sort of philosophical orientation is appropriate for political thinking for our times today. Accordingly, his works cover philosophical engagements with figures ranging from Aristotle to Hegel and Heidegger, from Kant to Adorno, Lacan and Habermas, and from Farabi to Gandhi and Abdülkerim Suruç. And with philosophical currents extending from existentialism, phenomenology and hermeneutics to critical theory and postmodernism. In his book titles, he prefers to use terms like twilight, margins, between, beyond, and he refers to his works as exercises, journeys, or encounters, reflecting the modesty of a certain post-Enlightenment attitude as well as the scope and sweep of an ecumenical, cross-civilizational perspective. Given such an impressive background, our guest today is one of those rare personalities who could speak with some authority on the promises and liabilities of cosmopolitanism. This is also an opportunity for us to express our gratitude, for he has been in our foundation, Bilim ve Sanat Vakfı, for several occasions, and he has contributed some of our earliest discussions leading to the establishment of this university. Please join me in welcoming Fred Dallmayr.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Ahmed Okumurs, for your introduction. Mr. Rector, colleagues, students, I'm extremely happy to be here because in a way, I have been involved with Sehir University from the very beginning. When Sehir University was just on a piece of paper, an idea in somebody's mind, and we talked about it, the future of a possibly new model of a university, which would overcome some of the dilemmas of previous eras and bring us into a new era, a new conception, a new model of thinking, which would overcome some of the dilemmas and the conflicts of the past, especially the conflict between secularism and faith. And that has been a great inspiration to me, and have been very happy to participate in some of the initial discussions on this issue. And now today I want to talk about the question of cosmopolitanism. You have the title right here, and especially about different meanings of cosmopolitanism, different conceptions of cosmopolitanism that one can differentiate. I have a certain preference for one conception of cosmopolitanism, but I want to outline also some competing conceptions of cosmopolitanism. So let me begin. The legacy of Western modernity is ambivalent. On the one hand, it has given to us inspiring ideas of global brotherhood and universal justice. But on the other hand, in the aftermath of what is called the Peace of Westphalia, modernity has also launched an agenda of nationalism, of the nation state, an agenda often copied and supplemented by equally self-contained sub-nationalisms. Now, during the 19th and 20th centuries, this nationalist agenda was steadily rising, steadily upsurging, engendering first a series of interstate wars, very bloody interstate wars, and then, of course, climaxing in the two world wars of the last century. In the midst of all these calamities, the broader civilizational vision was not totally extinguished, and its core was often captured in the phrase or the term cosmopolitanism. There was a German poet by the name of Heinrich Heine, the German poet Heinrich Heine. He argued that exclusive nationalism was a sign of the past, a sign of backwardness, whereas brotherhood and sisterhood signaled the future. Criticizing in very harsh terms the coarse and unwashed character of nationalism, Heinrich Heine, the poet, celebrated what he called a sentiment which is the most splendid and sacred thing that Germany has ever produced, namely humanity, the universal brotherhood of human beings, the cosmopolitanism to which our greatest minds, Lessing, Herder, Schiller, Goethe, Jean-Paul, and all the educated people in modern Germany have always paid tribute. Let me just briefly interrupt. If my English is not completely intelligible to you, please interrupt me and say, what do you mean? What are you saying? So, I don't want to talk to myself. I already know some of the script. I want to talk to you, and for that reason I have to communicate with you and speak to you. And unfortunately, I do not speak Turkish. I regret this very, very much because I know it's a very beautiful language. I've listened to it. I know some of the songs. So I have to talk to you in English. But I want to really speak to you in such a way that you also can follow. And if there's a point where you say, no, I cannot understand, just raise your hand and I will try to explain it in a somewhat different way. Now, so there's a background of nationalism, but also of cosmopolitanism. Now, in recent times, the cosmopolitan vision of Heinrich Heine has again been challenged by all kinds of exclusivism and nationalism. As a countermove to social and cultural interaction, we witness in many parts of the world the return to very exclusivist forms of what is called identity politics. And I noticed this especially in the country I was raised in, was born in Germany, the upsurge of a very restrictive and mean-spirited kind of identity politics, nationalism, where identity is defined in national, ethnic, sometimes religious terms. This exclusivism is also manifested in the erection of new walls or fences. Remember, we had in Germany the Berlin Wall, and finally it came down in 1989. Finally, the Berlin Wall came down, was dismantled. And now we have these new walls coming up, excluding people. Walls between the United States and Mexico, for instance. Huge, long wall. Keep the Hispanics, the Mexicans out. But then we also know the huge wall between Israel and Palestine to separate people, And then we have these new restrictions on immigration in many countries, also in the United States. Now, in this context, in this present context, there is certainly a great need to reaffirm the cosmopolitan idea. And this reaffirmation is fortunately widely shared, or at least shared by many intellectuals. As my friend, the political philosopher Sheila Ben Habib has recently said, and quite correctly, cosmopolitanism has become one of the key words of our times. One of the key terms of our times is cosmopolitanism. And this is certainly to be welcomed. Now, unhappily, the popularity of the term cosmopolitanism does not necessarily clarify its meaning. What do we mean by this term cosmopolitan? Frequently used, but what does it mean? Now, in the following, in my talk, I want to take some steps toward the clarification of the meaning of cosmopolitanism. And I do this by differentiating between some possible meanings of the term, and especially three meanings of the term I will differentiate. An empirical cosmopolitanism, a normative cosmopolitanism, and a practical cosmopolitanism. So this will be three different meanings of the term cosmopolitanism. In a first step, noting the close connection between cosmopolitanism and what is called globalization, I turn attention to the extension of global markets and communication networks, the internet, Facebook, Twitter, all parts of globalization. Now, taken in this sense, cosmopolitanism refers to an ongoing and empirically observable and verifiable process of border crossing and hybridization. Now, this means that the borders become fluid. Everything is transgressed through the internet and through Facebook and Twitter. You erase all borders and all limitations of time and space. In a second step, I move from this empirical description to the normative level. That is, cosmopolitanism as a normative vision. Whether this vision is formulated by Immanuel Kant as a demand for global justice, or in a slightly different way by Jürgen Habermas as the redemption of validity claims, what he calls validity claims. So I make a claim that this is right, and this is then contested, and if I'm successful, then I have redeemed a validity claim, the claim to truth or the claim to ethical rightness So different ways of establishing a normative standard of global justice. But noting the dilemmas in this normative formulation, namely the remaining conflict between what ought to be and what unfortunately is, that means between the vision and the reality, I turn in the final step to a cosmopolitanism as practiced on the ground, that is the agenda of a global pedagogy, a global educational process, cultivating the search for a viable cosmos, an ordered universe, reconciling the split between reality and vision, or the gulf between global and local dimensions of public life. So these are three different notions of cosmopolitanism, and I want to turn now to the first one and then proceed from there. First, globalization. Now, am I still with you? We are together? Okay. Okay. Cosmopolitanism and globalization are clearly closely connected and on some level overlapping, but they are not synonyms. It is wrong to use globalization and cosmopolitanism as synonyms, as the same term. Also, capturing some features of cosmopolitanism, globalization is limited to various empirical processes which have gained great prominence in our time. In the view of one expert or student of that field, David Held, globalization, he says, means a set of processes which are reshaping the organization of human activity, stretching political, economic, social, and communicative networks across regions and across the globe. Now, among these processes, he gives pride of place to economic and financial transactions carried out under liberal or what is called neoliberal auspices. As he says, for the past 2 or 3 decades, the agenda of economic liberalization and global market integration, the so-called Washington Consensus, as it is called, has been the mantra of many leading economic powers and financial institutions, end of quote. Now, this view is corroborated by the German sociologist Ulrich Beck, B-E-C-K, Ulrich Beck, who is also concerned about definition, what it means. Now, he says, in public discourse, the fashionable term globalization is understood primarily in a one-dimensional sense of economic globalization, and is closely connected with what one called globalism, a term that captures the idea of a global market and defends the virtue of neoliberal economic expansion and the utility of allowing capital, commodities, and labor to move freely across borders. So this is a common conception of globalization as mainly economic transactions. Even opponents of globalization, he says, tend to agree with this primary identification with economic transactions and their social ramifications. Now, in the aftermath of the economic and financial disaster which we experienced in the last several years, 2008, 2009, I don't know to which extent the economic disaster has reached Turkey, but it certainly has devastated the West. It has devastated the United States, devastated Western Europe, and to some extent also Asian markets. So in the aftermath of this disaster, the benefits and accomplishments of neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus have come under critical scrutiny, depriving them of their status as a global mantra or global ideology. Held is instructive in this respect by exposing the glaring defects and shortcomings of this kind of globalization. This model, he states, bears a heavy responsibility for failing to address important areas of market failure, such as the problem of what economists call externalities, illustrated by environmental degradation, the inadequate development of non-market social forces, including the inadequate provision for public goods such as education, health services, transportation, and the underemployment of available productive resources in the world. Now, these market failures reached their culmination in the great financial crisis that I mentioned of 2008, 2009, where high levels of consumer spending in the West, fueled by easy access to credit, created ultimately what is called a global liquidity overflow, the transaction overflow of financial capital, evident in massive asset bubbles and excess leverage. Now, these are economic terms, so if they're not quite evident to you, don't worry about it. It's just a big mess, a big chaos, a catastrophe. In Held's critical assessment, he says the key fault lines can be traced to the totalizing ideology of privatization, neoliberalism, and deregulation of the market, which gave rise to a light-touch regulatory system or no regulatory system that encouraged risk-taking and allowed money to be diverted into very specific areas, especially mortgage speculation and off-balance sheet activity. Now, you probably have heard of these, the hedge funds and all these things that occurred during this time. But as a result of this, you know, millions of people suffered financial bankruptcy. Millions of people had to be moved out of their homes because they could not pay the mortgages which had been given by bankers recklessly, you know, knowing that they would not be able to repay. So this was part of globalization. Now, these shortcomings of globalization do not by themselves challenge the celebration of global liquidity or transaction flows. As Karl Marx has noted long ago, under the impact of capitalism, he said, everything solid melts into air. Everything solid melts into air. Now, the fact that present-day globalization is not tightly bound up with market transaction is demonstrated also by the rapid expansion of communications facilities and global travel. I referred previously, you know, to Facebook, Twitter, Internet, and so forth. Ulrich Beck speaks in this context of, he calls the new metaphor of liquidity. That means easy transaction, stating that today neither boundaries nor relations mark the difference between one place or another, in the sense that boundaries are becoming blurred while relations are entering into constantly shifting constellations. End of quote. Citing a recent sociological study, tellingly titled, it's a beautiful title expressing what is going on, Global Culture Industry, the Mediation of Things, that everything is melted in the transaction flows, the global culture industry. Beck reaches the conclusion that social structures are increasingly dissolving into streams of human beings, of information processes, of goods and specific signs, of cultural symbols. What emerges at this point is, he says, a sociology without societies, characterized by a single-minded empirical and conceptual focus on mobility. Everything is anchored in total mobility, a category that supplants traditional sociological concepts of structure and community. Okay, now there are, of course, many drawbacks to this notion of globalization. The sociologist Ulrich Beck uses a very correct term or a very telling term when he talks about a banal cosmopolitanism. Banal, that means superficial, insignificant, worthless, banal kind of cosmopolitanism, which resembles what the literature professor Stanley Fish at one point called a boutique cosmopolitan, a boutique multiculturalism. A boutique multiculturalism means that you are a multiculturalist if you go to a cafeteria and you mix together Chinese food and Italian food, Spanish food, French food, and American food, and Turkish food. This is boutique cosmopolitan or multiculturalism. You don't really care about any of these things. You just sample them. You know? You just want to have a taste of them and then go away. So this is also banal cosmopolitanism. Under the impact of global consumerism, Beck states, the familiar and local becomes the playground of universal experiences, the locus of encounters and interminglings, of anonymous coexistence, and the overlapping of possible worlds and global dangers. What is banal about this cosmopolitanism is the lack of any personal and genuine engagement or commitment. The indiscriminate search for novelty for its own sake, for the sake of a vacuous self-indulgence. In the pursuit of banal aims, Beck states, cosmopolitanism becomes itself a commodity. Cosmopolitanism itself becomes a commodity on the market. Because, he says, the glitter of cultural difference sells well on the market. Okay. Now, there are also costs involved and consequences, human consequences involved in this kind of banal form of cosmopolitanism, where cosmopolitanism is identified with this kind of globalization in terms of market processes and communications processes. These processes have been highlighted by a number of analysts, but nobody has identified these consequences more clearly than the famous sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. So I'm turning now to a sociologist, a British sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, who wrote a book, Globalization, the Human Consequences of Globalization. Here he depicts the social effects of unlimited liquidity and mobility. In his portrayal, the ongoing, what he calls time-space compression, that time and space don't matter anymore, everything is mobility. The erasure of space-time boundaries encapsulates, he says, the gist of the present-day transformation of the parameters of the human condition. In the course of this globalization, mobility climbs to the rank of the uppermost value among all the other values, and the freedom to move and to move fast becomes the main stratifying factor of our late modern or postmodern times. In our postmodern context, it says the globalized individual is in a way catapulted into a dimension beyond space and time, where the differences between the now and the there, the here and the then, the close by and the far away simply are erased. Now, undaunted by this kind of globalism, Bauman injects sober ethical considerations. The new mobility, he says, the mobility of globalization, implies, in fact, a radical unconditionality, a disconnection from obligations, and ultimately the freedom to contribute to daily life and the perpetuation of social community. There is another even more sobering consequence entailed by nomadic or banal cosmopolitanism, namely a deep social division. Alongside the emerging planetary dimension of business, finance, trade, and information flows, a localizing and space-fixing process is set in motion, and these two interconnected processes sharply differentiate the existential conditions of populations from each other. In other words, there are those who can be mobile, who can travel, who belong to this global trend-setting elite, those who belong to this globalized elite, and others who are left behind and are left to their local conditions. Putting the argument in a nutshell, Bauman concludes, rather than homogenizing the human condition, the technological annulment of the traditional distinction between space and time and the limitations of space and time render social meanings extraterritorial in a way that the territory is stripped of any meaning that it might have to its local inhabitants. So there are these social, political implications of globalization, but also the psychological and psychopathological implications of globalization. I did not mention one example which Bauman mentions, namely the pathologies which can result from a radical globalizing perspective. Namely, that people are overburdened by the demands of this jet-setting globalism. Their psychological structure is simply unable to keep up with these demands of total mobility, of total transaction flows. And we have the example, the recent example of the director of the International Monetary Fund. The director of the International Monetary Fund, who was caught in a very, very strange situation where he clearly could no longer cope with his life. He clearly was at a loss how to behave. He could no longer control himself. He was no longer able to situate himself properly. So, I mean, these are the psychological or pathological consequences of this global elitism that we have in the world today. And of course, this man, this director of the IMF, was not alone. This is a widespread pathology among many of the bankers of the high finance speculators in all the global markets. They're all psychologically damaged, damaged people in many ways, because they can no longer cope with their condition. They have no relationship. They have no more concept of what it means to live a decent life. You know, they're completely abstracted from themselves, from their environment, from their family, from their friends. They're floating above everywhere, you know, in that space, in that global space of high finance. That is one side of cosmopolitanism. This is what one calls banal cosmopolitanism or banal globalization. Now I want to turn to another side of cosmopolitanism, other meaning of cosmopolitanism, namely a more ethical meaning of cosmopolitanism. I have now talked about sort of empirical trends which characterize cosmopolitanism. One can call a descriptive cosmopolitanism and then a banal cosmopolitanism. But I want to turn to a normative dimension of cosmopolitanism. In many ways, this idea of a normative cosmopolitanism was inaugurated by Western philosophers starting from Descartes, who differentiated the cogito from the external world and made the whole world possible or object for all human speculation and for scientific investigations. Now, with some modifications, this perspective was continued and was refined and was fleshed out, and perhaps the most famous embodiment, the famous formulation of a normative cosmopolitanism comes to us from the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, is identified with the normative idea of cosmopolitanism, which he has formulated in many, many different ways, but especially in one of his famous writings, which is called Perpetual Peace. In Perpetual Peace, there he has this idea of a cosmopolitan law or cosmopolitan legal system which would trump or which would be beyond all the national civil laws or nationally restricted laws and also interstate laws. So he has this distinction between different legal orders, domestic law, international law, and cosmopolitan law. And on the basis of this distinction, he introduced a number of important principles which should govern the cosmopolitan global dimension of humanity, and these principles are formulated in terms of principles of justice. So I will not have time to go in great detail into Kant's philosophy with regard to cosmopolitan law. Let me just mention some additional people who have fleshed out in great detail the idea of a normative dimension of cosmopolitanism. And some of these people have made enormous impact on contemporary thinking about cosmopolitanism. Let me just mention 2 or 3 names which are quite famous in the literature. People who study international politics or international relations, as it is called, are quite familiar with these names. One such strand of normative cosmopolitanism was introduced or initiated by a philosopher by the name of John Rawls. Now, John Rawls wrote a famous book, A Theory of Justice. Now, he there identified what we mean by justice and how we can rationally, conceptually, arrive at a universal principle of justice applicable to all people across the globe. Now, this he formulated first of all in what is the book called A Theory of Justice. What you do in the theory of justice, you first of all abstract from all the contingent limitations of place and time where you're located, whether you are a German or an American or a Frenchman or a Turkish person. You abstract from all this, and on the basis of a purely rational calculation, you try to figure out, to imagine what would be the universal principles to which all the people in the world could agree to. So that was the basic idea of John Rawls, and of course it's very much inspired by Kantian philosophy. Now he developed it further, this idea further in the notion, in a book which is called The Law of Peoples, where he fleshed out how this kind of universal idea of justice could be formulated in a very concrete setting of our contemporary global world. Now, John Rawls has had an enormous influence on many other people in international relations, and I don't know how many students here are familiar with international studies, international relations. But the most famous names in this domain, all of them follow, to some extent, the Kantian initiative, Kant's initiative of a global justice. Most famous names are people like Charles Bates. Probably have heard of Charles Bates' name. And then especially Thomas Pogge, P-O-G-G-E, has written a very famous book on global justice. He also is clearly in the Rawls tradition. He wrote a book called Realizing Rawls in 1989, and then precisely tried to implement the ideas of John Rawls and of Immanuel Kant in contemporary international politics, make them applicable to international politics. Now, another version of this idea of a normative cosmopolitanism derives from the writings of Jürgen Habermas, the critical theory of Jürgen Habermas, for whom the basic idea is to discover universal principles through, through a universal discourse. That is, through a communicative action in which all participants can make claims or make, make assertions Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you very, very much. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to present, the normative position on cosmopolitanism, which of course is quite different from the first position I've outlined, this kind of globalization, which consists basically simply in transactions, economic transactions, and information flows, which occur empirically, but have no normative dimension of them. So from Kant comes this idea of a global justice normatively established on the basis of a pure reason or transcendental reason, which John Rawls then translates into what he calls an original position in which we have abstracted from all our contingent qualities or particularities, and in which we are ultimately all the same in this original position. We are pure egos. And on that basis, we try to figure out what would be a system of universal justice in which all of us would be satisfied by the normative quality of this justice. So this was, as I say, continued by a number of people in international relations, and I mentioned some of them, Beitz and Pogge and so forth. And then I mentioned Jürgen Habermas, who transforms the idea of Kantian universal reason into a universal discourse. That means a process of communication, where everybody who has a stake in a certain issue can make an argument, can contribute an argument to a universal debate or communication or discourse. And this discourse hopefully would lead to an agreement on what is universal or global justice. So this is the Habermasian notion of a normative cosmopolitanism, okay? A normative cosmopolitanism. There are two main strands, the Kantian strand, which goes through John Rawls, the Habermasian strand, which then is continued by people like Sheila Ben Habib, who I mentioned at the very, very beginning, by David Held, and other people in international relations. So far so good, I hope. We have been communicating. You see, I'm also a little bit educated by the Habermasian critical theory, the discourse theory, where we are engaged in a communication effort. And of course, if I do not communicate, then everything is not very meaningful, not very helpful. But you see the basic lines that I have been trying to develop. I leave out a great number of details because they would just burden our discussion. What I want to get at, basically, is that while I greatly admire the vision, the power of rational argumentation and of rational insight displayed in normative cosmopolitanism, I find there is a deficit in normative cosmopolitanism, namely a deficit of the translation of the normative dimension into the practical dimension. There is a gap, a huge gap between the abstract ideal and the cosmopolitan life in which we find ourselves. It is for this reason that I turn in a third step to what I call a practical cosmopolitanism, in which the main effort is not so much on rational argumentation, but on lived experience, on lived interaction, on practical engagement with others across cultures. So this is what I have come to define, as the dialogical approach, or also the hermeneutical approach, where we engage with one another in learning from one another. So I'm not presupposing that you are just an abstract ego without any qualifications or any contingent qualities. You're not a Cartesian ego or a Kantian consciousness, but you're a concrete human being coming from concrete traditions, cultures, contexts. So I assume that we are all contextualized in some way. We are coming from a certain background. We have certain assumptions, certain prejudices, certain frames of reference in which we live, and we make sense of the world in terms of this frame of reference. And these frames of references are not all the same. So it's not like Rawls's original position where we are all the same because we have abstracted from all our contingencies, from all our cultural particularities. We have not abstracted now. We are starting from the situation that we are all contingently situated in time and place. And when we then encounter each other, we have to take into account these differences of cultural habits, customs, beliefs, languages, frames of significance. And how do we then come to any kind of understanding? It's only through engagement, through mutual interaction, and ultimately through processes of translation. Translation, not only textual translation, but ethical translations, that I translate your worldview, your perspective into something which makes sense from my perspective. That I come to see what you mean when you say something. That I come to see from where you are coming. And this is a kind that has to happen on the ground. It cannot happen on the level of abstract reasoning. It has to happen on the level of lived experience, what I call lived experience. Okay, so this is what I call practical cosmopolitanism, and there are many sources which sustain this approach of a practical cosmopolitanism. One such approach comes, or one such resource comes to us from American pragmatism, the tradition of John Dewey, who always emphasized the centrality of concrete experience over abstract reasoning. He was a very strong critic of what he called intellectualism. That means to try to make sense of the world always from a pure rational perspective, from a purely intellectual perspective. He criticized this as a form of arrogance, a form of assuming that we can figure out everything in our mind before even coming into contact with concrete experiences. So this kind of prejudice of intellectualism, John Dewey and the whole pragmatic tradition tried to undermine by the emphasis on concrete experience, lived experience in concrete contexts where I have to take into account where you come from. What are your feelings? What are your beliefs? Why do you hold these beliefs? And how can I come to terms with these beliefs? How can I come to understand your beliefs? Well, language, I need to translate language. But more than that, I have to enter into your frame of reference. You know, what is your frame of reference which makes sense to you? We all have frames of reference because we seek meaning in our lives. We cannot just live in the day and forget about everything and just eat and feed ourselves, you know, like animals. We have to make sense of our life. We find meaning in our life, and this only we do in terms of a frame of reference which is meaningful. And where does this frame of reference come from? Well, it comes from language, it comes from custom, it comes from tradition, it comes from religion, it comes from education. And there's no uniformity here. It's not that we start from an original position where everybody is alike. I mean, that's my basic objection to John Rawls. We don't start from an original position where everybody is the same, and then on this position we figure out universal principles of justice. This is a very, shall I say, elusive and somewhat arrogant form of rationalism, that all from top down we can all organize principles of cosmopolitanism, of cosmopolitan life. No, in my view, we can only arrive from the bottom up, namely by, first of all, realizing where I come from. I have to try to understand where I come from. That means I have, first of all, to learn about my own tradition. How can I engage in a discussion with you if I don't even know who I am, where I come from, and what my language means, and what my frame of reference is? I cannot begin to dialogue with you or to understand you if I don't know anything about myself. In other words, if the words I use, the meanings I use, are not intelligible to me, if they are not transparent to me, I have no idea what it means. For instance, if I come, let's say I grew up in Germany, let's say I come from a Christian background. How can I enter into a discussion with you if I have no conception, no idea what it means to be Christian? What would be the point of even engaging with somebody else if I don't know where I'm coming from and what the terms mean, you know, what the tradition says about Christianity, what the tradition means by that. But beyond this, of course, coming from Europe, and living in America, I am also raised in a framework which we call, for better or worse, modernity. Now, okay, I live in a frame of significance, which we call, for better or worse, modernity. What does that mean? I have to have some kind of notion as what modernity means, what modernity has done to me, what modernity does to human life, and how I can come to understand modernity and live with it. How can I be able to fathom or to understand what is happening in the modern world? I am a modern being. So what does it mean to me that I am modern? I'm not ancient. I'm not a Greek. I'm not, you know, I'm not an Egyptian. I'm not an Assyrian. I'm a modern Western person. So what does it mean for me to say that I'm a modern person? Now, I have to have some understanding. That means I have to reflect on my own background before I even enter into your background. But the same goes for you. I mean, if you want to understand what somebody coming, let's say, from the United States, what they're talking about, you have first to ask yourself, where do I come from? How can I make sense of what that person is saying? And for this, I have first of all to understand my frame of reference. Now, that person coming from the United States, probably when he comes to Turkey, will assume that you have some kind of Muslim background. Maybe not, but maybe you do. And you will he will expect from you that you can articulate some of your frame of reference or some of your beliefs. If you cannot articulate that or even suggest what it would be, then that person will just construct something out of nothing and just construct the idea of Islam from scratch. And this is what happens all too frequently, that we have an abstract conception of some kind of a religion or ideology or framework without having actual contact with the people who grew up in that framework and who only are the witnesses, the only living witnesses of that framework. So that's the only basis where you can actually have experience with that framework, not in the textbook, you know, not as an abstraction, but as a lived experience. You have to see how people live a certain background, a certain experience. So that goes for Muslims, it goes for Christians, it goes for Buddhists, it goes for Hindus, for everybody. It goes for people coming from the East or from the West. So all of this means a form of practical engagement, and this is what I call a practical cosmopolitanism, a form of engagement, of engaged interaction. And translation, yes, translation is very important. We all translate constantly. We translate our own thoughts in order to make it intelligible to somebody else. And as soon as you say something to me, I will try to translate it into a frame of reference which makes sense to me. So yes, through translation, through dialogue, through continued encounters, this is how we learn from each other. And this is how I think we can build up slowly a cosmopolis, a cosmopolitan space or cosmopolitan sphere in which we can live together, hopefully peacefully. It cannot be dictated from above. It cannot be done by global politicians. It can also not be done by global corporations and by global finance. It can only be done by people on the ground who take each other seriously and engage with each other and try to learn from each other. And from there, through this interaction, slowly come to an understanding what it means to live together in this world. And hopefully through this, live together peacefully and not in a belligerent way or in a violent way. Now we have altogether too much violence in this world, so that I don't have to emphasize that point. I mean, the whole point of the practical cosmopolitanism for me is that it contributes to global peace and not to more global violence. Now let me just end on a note which may not immediately be obvious, but it's the following, that a practical cosmopolitanism also takes the local seriously. It's not just the global. You know, under the impact of globalization and the expansion of global markets, we tend to assume that everything that is important happens on the most distant, the most global level, the most universal level. From the perspective of a practical cosmopolitanism, yes, we are engaged in a global world where everything is in interaction, where we cannot ignore each other. But at the same time, it means that the global does not take precedence over local. Because what it means to be engaged with one another, you learn at home. You learn in engagement with your family, with your friends, with your peer groups, with your fellow students, with your teachers. You learn at home what it means to be engaged. I thoroughly distrust people, you know, who are, you know, deeply committed to the plight of the people in Tibet. Now, I'm also committed to the people in Tibet, but who are only committed to people in Tibet and who care nothing about their family, who complain about torture in Abu Ghraib and go home and beat their wives Huh? They have a global commitment, but a total local amnesia. Commitment starts on the local level, starts at home. That's where you learn it. And from there, you expand it slowly. But what an ethical commitment is only practice. And practice means you have to practice it daily in a concrete context with concrete people that mean something to you and who can make demands on you even if you don't like it. If somebody close to you suddenly falls ill, has to go to hospital, you have to visit her. You may not have time to visit. You may not want to visit. You have to visit. You have to be available. And that's where things happen, you know. That's where you learn how to be human, how to be a human being. That's, of course, what the old sages long ago told us. That's what Aristotle told us. Ethics has to be practiced, has to be cultivated. Ethics is like playing piano. You cannot just sit down at the piano and be a pianist. You have to practice daily, every day of your life. And the same in ethics. You have to cultivate the virtues on a practical level, very concrete level, every day. And this is how you slowly arise to the global level or the cosmopolitan level. And this is the meaning of the cosmos. The ordered life does not just lie on the global level, that if you want to find the good life, the ordered life, the cosmos, then you have to go to Washington or to China, wherever. The good life does not just lie out there, you know, but it's right here. It has to start right here. And if you practice that, the cosmos, right at home, then the cosmos might grow and might become a global possibility, a global way of life. There are some ways, you know, where people have expressed this in Western philosophy. People have talked, you know, that the universal is always present in the particular. There is what they call an indwelling of the universal in the particular, in the concrete. But the same idea, for instance, there's an example. A great philosopher, Gottfried Leibniz, he said that the universe is composed of monads. But he said, these monads do not have windows. Why do not have windows? It does not mean they're close to the others, but because everything in the world is already reflected within one single monad. Everything in the world is contained in one single monad. But you find this also in some Asian philosophical traditions. The great Confucian thinker Mencius, you know, there's Confucius, then comes Mencius, the second Confucian thinker. He had this to say. He had left these memorable lines to us. He says, the ethical way of life, what the Asians call the Tao, it's the ethical way of life, lies in what is near, but people always think it is far away. One's task lies in what is simple, but people always seek it in what is complicated. If everyone would treat their kin, their family person as family, their elders as elders, their brothers as brothers, and their sisters as sisters, the whole world would be at peace, would be a cosmos. I think that's something to reflect upon. In a similar, more religious idiom, the Indian poet Kabir, Indian great bhakti poet Kabir, of whom one does not know whether he was Hindu or Muslim or maybe something else. He had this to say: no need to go outside or abroad. Your front yard is the holy Banaras. Banaras is the holy city in India. Your front yard is the holy Banaras. Absolutely, absolutely. There's a lady all the way, there are two people all the way in the back. Let me see.
Thank you for your presentation. I was intrigued by your sort of brave take of Rawls and your rejection of his convictions, because it's hard to hear scholars rejecting his convictions all the time. So I was wondering whether you could tie that to the current debates now and your, let's say, your list of cosmopolitanism and your sort of vision of panacea for a better world, for a world without violence. If we could bring that to a further point of multiculturalism and turn to the interculturalist debates and sort of try to adapt interculturalism to your panacea for the New World vision, and how sufficient are those debates, and if they're not, in what way they're not. Thanks.
Thank you. Are people here familiar with the debate about multiculturalism that is presently happening in many parts of the world, but especially in Europe? Especially in Europe, there's a very intense debate about multiculturalism. That it is useless and that it is obnoxious, that it damages national identity. We have multicultural communities where there are many different cultures living together. This is destructive of the nation, of national identity. So there's a widespread issue, a debate in many parts of the world. It's in America, but especially in Europe, in France and in Germany. Issue of multiculturalism, the so-called failure of multiculturalism. I think this debate is wrong. Debate is completely wrong. There's a very famous example in Germany, and has generated enormous debate. A book which was published by one of writer. It says that Germany abolishes itself. Germany schafft sich ab, abolishes itself. Why? Because it lets in too many people of other cultures, too many people of other traditions. So this multiculturalism is destructive of national identity, of the identity of the nation. Now this is only one kind of multiculturalism is damaging. Only one culture, one kind of multiculturalism is dangerous and possibly destructive. And that's the kind of multiculturalism where you just throw people together, helter-skelter, sort of like in a smorgasbord or in a cafeteria, one thing next to the other, Okay, There are the French and the Germans and the Swedes and the Turkish and the Asians and all of them next to each other, and each one lives in sort of a ghetto. Each one lives in sort of a ghetto, and they do not actually share any common values, you know. Now this is a kind of shall I say, a state of nature, or state of war in Thomas Hobbes' term, the state of nature where everybody looks out just for himself or herself. One group has its lobby, the other group has its lobby, and this is a lobby and this lobby. So everybody has a different agenda. And of course, if this is the case, then the result is warfare. If it's not violent warfare, it's psychological warfare and political warfare. And that is very damaging. This is a wrong kind of multiculturalism. The good kind of multiculturalism, I still defend multiculturalism. A good kind of multiculturalism is precisely which practices the kind of practical cosmopolitanism or practical multiculturalism, where people do engage with each other and learn from each other and take each other seriously. Take each other seriously, not deny the fact that there are strangers in our midst, not deny the fact that there may be Turkish Gastarbeiter, you know, in Germany, and there are many, as you know. Not deny the fact and simply try to ignore them and try to put them into a ghetto. That is destructive. Rather, what you need to do is to try to integrate them. Now, not by assimilating them, but by taking them seriously and take their values seriously, their practices seriously, their customs seriously, their religion seriously. Then you have a chance of establishing a multiculturalism which is mutually beneficial, where all different factions learn from each other and are thereby strengthened, are lifted up by this learning experience. Then something good can happen from that. Every one of the groups in a multicultural society is transformed, is improved by this experience. So this kind of multiculturalism I definitely defend, but not the kind of multiculturalism that has been practiced in reality in many countries, because nobody wanted to take responsibility. Nobody wanted to do the work which is involved in real integration, in a real mutual engagement. This is real work. And it doesn't come just naturally. You have to invest yourself. You have to make an effort. There have to be schools. There have to be, you know, all kinds of facilities for people to come to you and live among you. There have to be schools. There have to be mosques. There have to be whatever in order to make them at home. So only in that way can you overcome the hostility. You know, there's frequently hostility. Of course, if there's a stranger coming and has strange practices, and you don't understand these practices, what does that mean? So you're hostile. But you can overcome it through engagement.
Professor Dallmayr, thank you very much for this really comprehensive kind of view of cosmopolitanism. I mean, three things I think you have done very nicely is, one, you offered a comprehensive view, and second, I think you did a very, very solid criticism of Rawls's original position, and three, you offered what you have just called practical cosmopolitanism, a kind of practical engagement and practical encounter, a sort of, I guess, authentic encounter rather than this formal institutional way that we see. I think all these 3 points are really very important. But I guess I'll try to play a little bit devil's advocate.
Okay.
I mean, so far in history, what we have seen so far is there are two major ways that societies interact with each other. One is commerce, and the other trade, and the other is war. And insofar as these and their consequences are concerned, we have a huge history of violence behind us. Given all that violence, and given, for instance, something like commerce, which is trade, which is, especially these days, a lot quicker than practical, authentic engagements and encounters, how are we actually going to be able to realize that kind of encounter under such a circumstance? And maybe carrying this a little further, your model, your ethical model of practical encounter, I wonder if, and this is maybe a little bit of a heavy criticism, I don't know, I'm not sure if I'm right, but I'll say it. I'm wondering if this is also re-articulating a kind of Rawlsian position at another level, because then aren't you assuming a kind of cultural ego this time in abstract, especially abstracted from history, history of violence, history of imperialism and all that. Your notion of culture, I think, carries this risk of carrying a kind of abstract cultural ego. I'm wondering, how would you respond to this?
Yes, well, thank you, Mr. Mahmoud. There are, of course, these very serious problems. I presented in a very simple way and somewhat facile way, you know, the notion of practical cosmopolitanism, but that there are enormous obstacles to that, enormous obstacles. And the main obstacles are, of course, the experience of injustices, the experience of exploitation, the experience of domination, the enormous suffering which people have undergone. How to deal with that, you know, how to wrestle with that, overcome this through engagement. I mean, in the United States, we had the history of slavery, of black slavery. It's a history of exploitation, of domination, of suffering, great suffering. How can a white person simply come and say, okay, let's forget all about this, you know, let's forget about that history of slavery, and let's be friends, you know. It's not that easy, not that easy. First of all, that whole history of slavery and of cruelty and of exploitation has to be brought out into the open. We have to face it. We have to face it. We have to see what has happened. And the black people have to have the ability to voice their grievances, you know, against the society in which they were enslaved. So it's not just say, well, let's be friends, let's bygones be bygones. It's not that easy. Persons who have been injured, deeply injured, require time and require a special kind of caring, of solicitude, to listen to their grievances. This is a process of healing, which is one of the most difficult things in life. The easiest thing in case of such oppression or exploitation, the easiest thing is just to resort to violence, to conflict, you know. You strike back at the person who has exploited you, has inflicted that suffering on you. You strike back and make that person suffer equally, if possible. That is the way of violence, you know. And it, in many ways, it seems to be the natural thing to do, to take revenge. We call it revenge. So this it is very clear. It's a very difficult thing. So the question is, how can we find a path beyond revenge, or on another way of then revenge, without ignoring the history of suffering? So that is the challenge. Now, for this one needs many forums where people can articulate their grievances. It's like a public therapy has to happen if you want to go away from revenge. You know, as the Mahatma Gandhi said, very correctly, he said, an eye for an eye for an eye, which is retaliation. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Nobody can see anymore because we're all without eyes. So if we don't want to do that, then we have to find a different way. And this is the way of reconciliation, a difficult way, a way which requires an enormous amount of engagement, of caring. It's not just the usual way of caring that you engage with somebody from a different background and you find it interesting to engage with this other person. No, it's engaging with a person whom you have harmed, whom you have been oppressing, whom you have damaged. To engage in reconciliation with that person is enormously, enormously difficult. But we have examples, you know, in history, in the United States, in Black history. We have the example of Martin Luther King, who tried to overcome that history of suffering through a process of healing. And the civil rights movement was basically a healing movement in the United States. It's not just the giving rights to somebody, but in addition to these rights, to make them comfortable in that society. But it's a very difficult process. We have the example, of course, of South Africa. South Africa, the question of the enslavement of the blacks in South Africa. And it required then a Truth and Justice Commission, very difficult process of allowing these people to air their grievances very concretely. And there was a process of enormous healing where people told stories, you know, of unbelievable cruelty, of horror, publicly, and confessed to having done these things. Now that's a difficult task, but that's also the task of cosmopolitanism. I have urged for a cosmopolitan Truth and Justice Commission, that all these people who have been harmed, who have been damaged, are able to vent their grievances. And that goes, of course, also for the Palestinian people. The Palestinians should have a chance not only to have a new state, which is fine, yes, but they should also have the chance of tell their story. Tell their story. Yes?
Professor Dallmayr. I mean, as Mahmoud said, your criticism of the Enlightenment rationalism in terms of its relation to cosmopolitanism is really good, and maybe we can add also to that, which you already implied, that this idea of universal rationalism not only contains a big gap, as you mentioned, but it also covers something up, which is power relations. I mean, the universal, mind or rationality that they talked about was actually the mind of Western European, Enlightenment intellectuals, which can't be universalized, I guess. So your position, this ethical, practical cosmopolitanism is of course much better, but as again you already mentioned, it has some challenges as well of its own. 2 questions come to my mind. One is more theoretical, which is the how to reconcile the epistemological differences between different cultures or civilizations when engaging with each other. I mean, every culture has its own sort of truth claims, absolute truths. Some say there's no such thing as absolute truth. So what are we going to do about this? How are we going to sustain the dialogue or interaction between these very different epistemological positions? One is this. The other one is, again, connected to Mahmoud's question, which is about the power relations dimension again. The injustices that you just mentioned were not historical only. They still continue, and still we have very asymmetrical power relations today between different societies and civilizations. So, I mean, how are we going to, again, have a dialogue between different groups when one of them is bombing the other one, for example?
Excellent, excellent, yes. Well, okay, the two excellent questions. The first one, the epistemological question, that is a dilemma. Frequently people run into this and they say, well, there's no exit from it. Because they say there are different linguistic frameworks, different customs, different frames of significance, and between them there is no possible translation. The truth claims do not match. This is sometimes called incommensurability. the different traditions are incommensurable to each other. They cannot be translated, cannot be communicated to each other. They are separate, they are self-enclosed, they're incommensurable. And that's frequently an objection made to my argument about a dialogical cosmopolitanism or practical cosmopolitanism. That's one of the main objections, incommensurability. I recognize that objection as an important objection, but I also think it is something which can be overcome. We can never overcome it totally. We can never overcome it totally because not everything is totally translatable into something else. But there are many dimensions, many areas, many levels of discourse which actually are to some extent translatable. And we have pretty good translations. We have pretty good translations of the Greek authors in Greek, Latin authors, and Asian, Chinese, and Arabic, and so forth. I mean, for better or worse, we live with translations. And to some extent, it works, I mean, if you have ever been at a conference where there are several languages spoken, you have these booths in the back where there are translators, and you have instantaneous translation. These translators, they translate, directly. I mean, instantly. It's a fabulous thing. It's like a miracle. But so there's a possibility to have at least some possibility of communication despite different languages, different frameworks. So the incommensurability claim, I think it can be overcome. The other is, of course, the major objection that is always thrown at me and at people who talk about communication and about dialogue and practical engagement, and that's always the power thing. People say everything is power. And then some people are educated, by some recent authors who emphasize power very, very much, and they say, you know, Michel Foucault, there's biopower, you know, and everything is biopower, and you cannot go beyond this biopower. You know, others that invoke Carl Schmitt, you know, and the tradition of Thomas Hobbes, and everything comes down to control, to command, to power, and dialogue is worthless, or it's hopeless. Hopeless. Everything is power, power, power. Well, the thing is this: you have to. I am the first to recognize the importance of power. You know. So the thing to do, which I would recommend, is to look power squarely at the face, not to ignore it, not to bypass it, but to recognize there are power differentials. And this power differential can be military power differential, economic power differentials, you know, can be technological power, can be psychological power. So there are many forms of power that people exercise over each other, you know, and we have to face them squarely, recognize them. There is this power differential. I simply cannot say, you know, that, for instance, Israel and the Palestinians are on an equal basis in terms of power. Which power? It's ridiculous. I mean, the one has a nuclear power, and the other have what? Knives, sticks, but I mean, it's not power equality. So the first thing we have to do is to equalize, to try to reduce the power differential. And this has to happen through a number of means. One is, of course, nuclear disarmament, what one calls nuclear disarmament. That means to reduce the spreading of nuclear weapons, that you eliminate the inequality of ultimate power. I mean, nuclear power is the ultimate power. You can destroy, you know, not just injure somebody, but you can destroy a whole society, you know. So anyway, this is, of course, a long-range process, disarmament, nuclear disarmament. The other is economic equalization. The economic differences today in the world are so grotesque, you know, grotesque, that it boggles the mind, you know, that a small group, a handful of people in the United States owns as much property as 60% of the rest of the population, you know. I mean, this is grotesque. The difference between the few people who have excess and the others who have almost nothing. And in the world, this is similar. And there are some very rich. Now, today, it's no longer the nation state who embodies the wealth, but the corporate elite, who are frequently transnational, you know. But the corporate elites, they own, I mean, the trillions and trillions of dollars, and millions of people live below the poverty line, below $1 a day or so. So that grotesque disproportion has to be remedied. And there are proposals to do that. There is one economist has proposed the so-called Tobin tax, the Tobin tax, which would levy a tax on all financial transactions around the world. And this would then be given to the least developed nations, you know, to up their present GOP or the present level of wealth or income. So economic equalization is absolutely necessary. And military equalization, or at least making it more equal than it was before. Technological is also the transfer of technology from across countries, from the most developed to the least developed countries. So all of these are points of struggle. Now, you see, one of the big mistakes that some people make about what I talk about practical cosmopolitanism, what the mistake frequently they make is they assume that this is easy, that this is not a struggle. By practical, I mean struggle. A struggle for cosmopolitanism. So practical struggle, the word struggle has to be in there in practical cosmopolitanism. It's not just that you practice what comes easy, but the hard thing is the struggle for cosmopolitanism. And for this you have to overcome exploitation and inequalities in the world. It's very clear. Otherwise, practical cosmopolitanism does not work, does not do what it's supposed to be doing. So this is, so these questions, incommensurability, power, these are the two main questions which are usually leveled against this approach. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your really thought-provoking speech. In fact, that it reminds me many questions, but just want to ask relating to from following the paths of Nurullah, the epistemological point of view, that you mostly focus cosmopolitanism in terms of cosmopolitanism, you're mostly speaking about the Kantian understanding of the cosmopolitanism. My question is, go beyond to the, is there any possible to go beyond to the Kantian understanding? I mean, it reminds me that there's some studies of the two Wimings and the other scholars, I mean, the Davutoğlu's alternative paradigms may be taken into consideration in terms of the different understanding of the cosmopolitanism without ignoring or without falling into the veil of ignorance. I mean, that how can we emancipate our mind or freedomize our minds without ignoring the Kantian understanding of cosmopolitanism? From the Kantian understanding, how can we emancipate our understanding of cosmopolitanism, the Kantian understanding of cosmopolitanism? That's why.
Well, I mean, thank you. But one thing I need to say, I'm not an anti-Kantian, so I'm not an anti-Rawlsian. I'm just saying they're not doing the job, really. They're not doing sufficiently what needs to be done. But I respect their insight, the power of their argument. I respect the Kantian vision of the perpetual peace and the idea of a cosmopolitan law and cosmopolitan justice. All that I respect. I just say that they don't show the way in the direction of that goal. They just postulate that goal that ought to be, that's an imperative. Kant always says it's an imperative. Okay, so it's an imperative. How do I get to this imperative? That's my worry, how do I get there? And this I can only do through practice and through practical struggle. So practical cosmopolitanism is a struggle to reach, yes, some of the goals that Kant outlined, but also modifying the Kantian idea and the Rawlsian idea, namely in that sense that the cosmopolitan peace that I have outlined, that I share with Kant, yes, I also am in favor of a perpetual peace, a cosmopolitan peace, but this cosmopolitan peace has to be much more diversified, has to recognize a much greater pluralism or plurality of cultures and traditions and languages than Kant would have recognized. Kant recognized the unity of reason. We are all rational beings, so we are all unified in reason. So reason unifies us all. Okay, that's nice. But we are not only rational beings. There are other important things where we are not unified in that way. And so the pluralism, which comes from culture, comes from religion, comes from our affects, our emotions, that has to be recognized also. There's a greater diversity. So the cosmopolis that I envisage is a highly diversified cosmopolis, a very pluralistic, multicultural cosmopolis, not the kind of unified, almost Platonic republic that Kant and Rawls envisaged. It's basically a kind of Platonic republic where the philosopher king is reason. Reason is the philosopher king who rules the whole city. So yeah, I would want to differentiate. There's a question in the back.
As we know from the psychological research or communication research, the communication or contact between different groups, different individuals does not necessarily bring understanding or genuine dialogue, as in terms of Martin Buber. So do you suggest any preconditions for the practice that you mentioned? Are there any conditions, or are there really, is it only possible under certain circumstances? So what do you think about this? So we also in the conflict resolution research try to understand this, and we differentiate different forms of reconciliation: political reconciliation, economic reconciliation, psychological and cultural reconciliation. So reconciliation at the psychological level or cultural level does not necessarily bring political or economic. Or do you suggest any conditions for this, the practice?
Yeah, there are several conditions for it. Some of them are material conditions. So if you are in utmost poverty and have to worry about your sheer survival, you are very unlikely to engage in very engaged communication with somebody who is very rich, or even with somebody who is moderately wealthy. So in cases of material or physical deprivation, it would be very unlikely that somebody would engage in this kind of practical cosmopolitanism. So for this reason, we have to provide the means, shall I say, the ground floor on which people can live and don't have to worry constantly about sheer survival needs, you know, because this would make it impossible to worry about anything else. So these are, I think, material conditions, economic conditions, physical conditions also. If you are desperately ill, you know, this cannot, that may prevent you from any kind of possible engagement with anybody else, you know. So there have to be health conditions, material conditions, economic conditions. Yes, some of it can be remedied, not all of it can be remedied. Some illnesses are terminal, you cannot help this. So I know we are finite human beings, we are mortal, so there are limitations to everything we can do. We have to face them and look at this concretely and try to figure out what can we practically do to remedy the situation. But in addition to this, there are moral preconditions. There's moral conditions of what one might call goodwill. A person who is absolutely, shall I say, hostile to everybody else, and to everybody except himself or herself. So, I mean, a person who is totally egocentric or unable to engage with anybody else cannot participate in such a practical cosmopolitanism. So yeah, there has, as a minimum condition, there's a goodwill of moving beyond yourself and moving toward the other. That goodwill to overcome yourself in some way, that is, yes, a precondition. But a total narcissist, you know, who only tries to look at his own picture all the time, cannot possibly develop this kind of goodwill. But this, yes, I would recognize as a precondition. So there's a physical and material precondition. There's a moral precondition, and the moral precondition is perhaps the most important, the most difficult, because we have too many narcissists, too many people totally enamored with themselves and unwilling to engage in any kind of dialogue with somebody else. These are basically uncaring people. They don't care. They don't care about anything but themselves. So for this, of course, education is crucial. Education what is the basic purpose of education? The purpose of education is like trying to draw somebody out of himself or herself, open up, to open up a person to new learning. That's what education does. It's opening up, making a process possible. So education is absolutely crucial for any of this to happen. And this is why I also call it a global pedagogy. It has to be a global pedagogy of learning. Learning about more than just your own prejudice and your own self-interest. Yeah, that's a difficult, that's why I say it's struggle. It's all the way struggle. Yeah. When Marx was once asked by his daughter Jenny, what is the most important thing in life? He said, struggle. Well, which is true, Nothing comes easy. Everything comes with struggle. But if everything came easy, it would be worthless. We would really not be terribly satisfied with it. So it's through struggle that we accomplish something. I hope I have not made you struggle too much this afternoon. Is there a further question, maybe? Anyway, I do want to thank you for your patience, your attention in a foreign language. This must have been difficult to listen to all of that. I've tried to articulate myself in not in very difficult ways to make it as accessible as possible. But I do very much appreciate your presence and your willingness, your goodwill. You see, your goodwill to listen to me. That's very important, And I always learn also through your questions. The questions, make me learn, draw me out of myself to learn more about what I'm saying, what I'm trying to say. Because whenever you say something, you don't know all of what you're saying. You're saying something and you think, yeah, I know what I'm saying, but you never know all that you're saying, because everything you say has multiple ramifications, interpretations going everywhere. So you don't quite know what you're saying, And so when I'm asked questions, I'm constantly drawn out of myself, beyond myself. And I say, oh, this is what I said. I have to reformulate this or restate it. So this is what the whole learning process is about. But to conclude, let me just say I'm exceedingly happy to see this happening at Sehir University. Because as I mentioned at the very beginning, I was deeply involved, cognitively but also emotionally, in this project of establishing this university in Istanbul. And I think if you have followed my argument, then you know why I care about this place, this university. Because it has a potential precisely to practice this kind of cosmopolitanism, That you care about your own tradition, about your own values, about your own faith, but you also are open to others, and you're willing to engage and to learn. And so this is what makes me exceedingly happy that in this first year of this university, I can come here and speak to you and with you and wish you all the good things in life, and that many good things may happen to you and to this university, inshallah.